This is a continuation of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, comprising Part 7, Chapters 6 through 10.
Part 7, Chapter 6. During the 4.5 months of that fighting, the war correspondents were billeted in the old town of Kassel, where, perched on a hill which looks over a wide stretch of Flanders, through our glasses we could see the sand dunes beyond Dunkirk, and with the naked eyes the whole vista of the battle line round Ypres, and in the wide curve all the countryside, lying between Aire and Hasbrouw and Notre Dame de Lorette. My billet was in a monastery for old priests on the eastern edge of the town, and at night my window was lighted by distant shell fire, and I gazed out to a sky of darkness rent by vivid flashes, bursts of red flame, and rockets rising high. The priests used to tap at my door when I came back from the battlefields all muddy, with a slime-plastered face, writing furiously, and an old padre used to plague me like that, saying, "What news? It goes well? Eh? Not too well, perhaps. Alas, it is a slaughter on both sides." "It is all your fault," I said once chaffingly to get rid of him. "You do not pray enough." He grasped my wrist with his skinny old hand. "Monsieur," he whispered, "after 80 years I nearly lose my faith in God. That is terrible, is it not? Why does not God give us victory? Alas, perhaps we have sinned too much." One needed great faith for courage then, and my courage, never much to boast about, ebbed low those days when I agonized over our losses and saw the suffering of our men and those foul swamps where the bodies of our boys lay in pools of slime, vividly colored by the metallic vapors of high explosives, beside the gashed tree stumps and the mangled corpses of Germans who had died outside their pillboxes, and when I saw dead horses on the roads out of Ypres, and transport drivers dead beside their broken wagons, and officers of ours with the look of doomed men, nerve-shaken, soul-stricken, in captured blockhouses, where I took a nip of whiskey with them now and then before they attacked again, and groups of dazed prisoners coming down the tracks through their own harrowing fire, and always, streams of wounded by tens of thousands. There was an old mill house near Vlamertinghe, beyond Goldfish Chateau, which was made into a casualty clearing station, and scores of times when I passed it, I saw it crowded with the walking wounded, who had trudged down from the fighting line, taking 11 hours, 14 hours sometimes to get so far. They were no longer cheerful, like the gay lads who came lightly wounded out of earlier battles, glad of life, excited by their luck. They were silent, shivering, stricken men, boys in age, but old and weary in the knowledge of war. The slime of the battlefields had engulfed them. Their clothes were plastered to their bodies. Their faces and hands were coated with that whitish clay. Their steel hats and rifles were caked with it. Their eyes, brooding, were strangely alive in those corpse-like figures of mud who huddled round charcoal stoves or sat motionless on wooden forms, waiting for ambulances. Yet they were stark in spirit still. "Only the mud beat us," they said. Man after man said that. We should have gone much farther except for the mud. Along the Menin Road there were wayside dressing stations for wounded, with surgeons at work, and I saw the same scenes there. They were not beyond the danger zone. Doctors and orderlies were killed by long-range shells. Wounded were wounded again or finished off. Some ambulances were blown to bits. A colonel who had been standing in talk with a doctor was killed halfway through a sentence. There was never a day in which Ypres was not shelled by long-range high velocities, which came howling overhead as I heard them scores of times in passing through those ruins with gas mask at the alert, according to orders, and steel hat strapped on, and a deadly sense of nostalgia because of what was happening in the fields of horror that lay beyond. Yet to the soldier farther up the Menin Road, Ypres was sanctuary in God's heaven. The little old town of Kassel on the hill, where once a Duke of York marched up and then marched down again, was beyond shell range, though the enemy tried to reach it and dropped 12-inch shells, which make holes deep enough to bury a coach and horses round its base. There is an inn there, the Hotel du Sauvage, which belongs now to English history, and Scottish and Irish and Welsh and Australian and Canadian. It was the last place along the road to Ypres where men who loved life could get a dinner sitting with their knees below a tablecloth, with candle light glinting in glasses, while outside the windows the flickering fires of death told them how short might be their tarrying in the good places of the world. This was a good place where the blinds were pulled down by Madame, who understood. Behind the desk was Mademoiselle Suzanne, a dainty rogue in porcelain, with wonderfully bright eyes and just a little greeting of a smile for any young officer who looked her way trying to get that greeting, because it was ever so long since he had seen a pretty face, and might be ever so long again. Sometimes it was a smile met in the mirror against the wall, to which Suzanne looked to touch her curls and see, like the Lady of Shalott, the pictures of life that passed. A man would tilt his chair to get that angle of vision. Outside, on these nights of war, it was often blusterous, very dark, wet with heavy rain. The door opened and other officers came in with waterproofs sagging round their legs and top boots muddy to the tags, abashed because they made pools of water on polished boards. "Pardon, madame. California ne fait rien, monsieur." There was a clip-clop of horses' hoofs in the yard. I thought of D'Artagnan and the musketeers who might have ridden into this very yard, strode into this very room, on their way to Dunkirk or Calais. Madame played the piano remarkably well, classical music of all kinds, and any accompaniment to any song. Our young officers sang. Some of them touched the piano with a loving touch and said, "Ye gods, a piano again," and played old melodies or merry ragtime. Before Passchendaele was taken, a Canadian boy brought a fiddle with him and played last of all, after other tunes, the long, long trail which his comrades sang. "Come and play to us again," said Madame. "If I come back," said the boy. He did not come back along the road through Ypres to Kassel. From the balcony one could see the night birds fly. On every moonlight night German raiders were about bombing our camps and villages. One could see just below the hill how the bombs crashed into St. Marie-Capelle and many hamlets where British soldiers lay, and where peasants and children were killed with them. For some strange reason Kassel itself was never bombed. "We are a nest of spies," said some of the inhabitants, but others had faith in a miraculous statue, and still others in Sir Herbert Plumer. Once when a big shell burst very close, I looked at Mademoiselle Suzanne behind the desk. She did not show fear by the flicker of an eyelid, though officers in the room were startled. "Vous n'avez pas peur, Mimi de la Mort? You are not afraid, even of death?" I asked. She shrugged her shoulders. "Je m'en fiche de la mort. I don't care a damn for death." The Hotel du Sauvage was a pleasant rendezvous, but barred for a time to young gentlemen of the Air Force, who lingered too long there sometimes and were noisy. It was barred to all officers for certain hours of the day without special permits from the AP-Mem, who made trouble in granting them. 3 Scottish officers rode down into Kassel. They had ridden down from Hellfire to sit at a table covered with a tablecloth and drink tea in a room again. They were refused permission, and their language to me about the APM was unprintable. They desired his blood and bones. They raised their hands to heaven to send down wrath upon all skunks dwelling behind the lines in luxury and denying any kind of comfort to fighting men. They included the PM in their rage, and all staff officers from Kassel to Boulogne and away back to Whitehall. To cheer up the war correspondents' mess, when we assembled at night after miserable days, and when in the darkness gusts of wind and rain clouted the window panes, and distant gunfire rumbled, or bombs were falling in near villages, telling of peasant girls killed in their beds and soldiers mangled in wayside burns, we had the company sometimes of an officer, a black-eyed fellow who told merry little tales of executions and prison happenings at which he assisted in the course of his duty. I remember one about a young officer sentenced to death for cowardice. There were quite a number of lads like that. He was blindfolded by a gas mask fixed on the wrong way round and pinioned and tied to a post. The firing party lost their nerve and their shots were wild. The boy was only wounded and screamed in his mask, and the APM had to shoot him twice with his revolver before he died. That was only one of many little anecdotes told by a gentleman who seemed to like his job and to enjoy these reminiscences. The battles of Flanders ended with the capture of Passchendaele by the Canadians, and that year's fighting on the Western Front cost us 800,000 casualties, and though we had dealt the enemy heavy blows from which he reeled back, the drain upon our manpower was too great for what was to happen next year, and our men were too sorely tried. For the first time the British Army lost its spirit of optimism, and there was a sense of deadly depression among many officers and men with whom I came in touch. They saw no ending of the war, and nothing except continuous slaughter, such as that in Flanders. Our men were not mythical heroes exalted by the gods above the limitations of nature. They were human beings with wives and children or mothers and sisters whom they desired to see again. They hated this war. Death had no allurement for them, except now and then as an escape from intolerable life under fire. They would have been superhuman if they had not revolted in spirit, though still faithful to discipline, against the foul conditions of warfare in the swamps, where, in spite of all they had, in that 4 months or so of fighting, achieved the greatest effort of human courage and endurance ever done by masses of men in obedience to command. Part 7, Chapter 7. At the end of those battles happened that surprising, audacious adventure in the Cambrai salient organized by the Third Army under General Byng, when on November 20, 1917, squadrons of tanks broke through the Hindenburg Line, and infantry streamed through the breach, captured hundreds of guns, 10,000 prisoners, many villages and ridges, and gave a monstrous shock to the German High Command. The audacity of the adventure lay in the poverty of manpower with which it was attempted and supported. The divisions engaged had all been through the grinding mill of Flanders and were tired men. The artillery was made up largely of those batteries which had been axle-deep in Flanders mud. It was clearly understood by General Byng and General Louis Vaughan, his chief of staff, that Sir Douglas Haig could not afford to give them strong reserves to exploit any success they might gain by surprise or to defend the captured ground against certain counterattacks. It was to be a surprise assault by tanks and infantry, with the hope that the cavalry corps might find its gap at last and sweep round Cambrai before the enemy could recover and reorganize. With other correspondents, I saw General Louis Vaughan, who expounded the scheme before it was launched. The charming man, with his professional manner, sweetness of speech, gentleness of voice and gesture, like an Oxford don analyzing the war correspondence of Xenophon, made no secret of the economy with which the operation would have to be made. "We must cut our coat according to our cloth," he said. The whole idea was to seize only as much ground as the initial success could gain, and not to press if resistance became strong. It was a gamble with a chance of luck. The cavalry might do nothing or score a big triumph. All depended on the surprise of the tanks. If they were discovered before the assault, the whole adventure would fail at the start. They had been brought up secretly by night, 400 of them, with supply tanks for ammunition and petrol lying hidden in woods by day. So the artillery and infantry and cavalry had been concentrated also. The enemy believed himself secure in his Hindenburg line, which had been constructed behind broad hedges of barbed wire with such wide ditches that no tank could cross. How, then, would tanks cross? That was a little trick which would surprise the Germans mightily. Each tank would advance through the early morning mists with a bridge on its nose. The bridge was really a big fascine or bundle of fagots about 1.5 yards in diameter and controlled by a lever and chain from the interior of the tank. Having ploughed through the barbed wire and reached the edge of the Hindenburg trench, the tank would drop the fascine into the center of the ditch, stretch out its long body, reach the bundle of fagots, find support on it, and use it as a stepping stone to the other side. Very simple in idea and effect. So it happened. And the mists favored us, as I saw on the morning of the attack at a little place called Beaumont, near Villers-Pluic. The enemy was completely surprised, caught at breakfast in his dugouts, rounded up in batches. The tanks went away through the breach they had made, with the infantry swarming round them, and captured Havrincourt, Hermes-Ribecourt, Gouzeaucourt, Masnieres, and Marcoing, and a wide stretch of country forming a cup or amphitheatre below a series of low ridges south of Bourlon-Wood, where the ground rose again. It was a spectacular battle, such as we had never seen before, and during the following days, when our troops worked up to Bourlon-Wood and through the intervening villages of Anneux, Graincourt, Containg, and Fontaine-Notre-Dame, I saw tanks going into action and cruising about like landships, with cavalry patrols riding over open ground, airplanes flying low over German territory, and masses of infantry beyond all trench lines, and streams of liberated civilians trudging through the lines from Marcoing. The enemy was demoralized the first day and made only slight resistance. The chief losses of the tanks were due to a German major of artillery who served his own guns and knocked out a baker's dozen of these monsters as they crawled over the Flesquieres ridge. I saw them lying there with the blood and bones of their pilots and crews within their steel walls. It was a Highland soldier who checked the German major. "You're a brave man," he said, "but you've got to D," and ran him through the stomach with his bayonet. It was this check at the Flesquieres ridge, followed by the breaking of a bridge at Masnieres under the weight of a tank and the holding of a trench line called the Rumilly Switch by a battalion of Germans who raced to it from Cambrai before our men could capture it, which thwarted the plans of the cavalry. Our cavalry generals were in consultation at their headquarters, too far back to take immediate advantage of the situation. They waited for the capture of the Rumilly Switch, and held up masses of cavalry whom I saw riding through the village of Ribecourt with excitement and exultation, because they thought that at last their chance had come. Finally, orders were given to cancel all previous plans to advance. Only one squadron, belonging to the Canadian Fort Garry Horse in General Seely's division, failed to receive the order. Their colonel rode after them, but his horse slipped and fell before he caught them up, and it was their day of heroic folly. They rode fast and made their way through a gap in the wire cut by the troopers, and came under rifle and machine gun fire, which wounded the captain and several men. The command was carried on by a young lieutenant, who rode with his men until they reached the camouflaged road southeast of the village of Rumilly, where they went through in sections under the fire of the enemy hidden in the banks. Here they came up against a battery of field guns, one of which fired point blank at them. They charged the battery, putting the guns out of action and killing some of the gunners. Those who were not destroyed surrendered, and the prisoners were left to be sent back by the supports. The squadron then dealt with the German infantry in the neighborhood. Some of them fled, while some were killed or surrendered. All these operations were done at a gallop under fire from flanking blockhouses. The squadron then slowed down to a walk and took up a position in a sunken road 1 kilometer east of Rumilly. Darkness crept down upon them, and gradually they were surrounded by German infantry with machine guns, so that they were in great danger of capture or destruction. Only 5 of their horses remained unhit, and the lieutenant in command decided that they must endeavor to cut their way through and get back. The horses were stampeded in the direction of the enemy in order to draw the machine gun fire, and while these riderless horses galloped wildly out of one end of the sunken road, the officer and his surviving troopers escaped from the other end. On the way back they encountered 4 bodies of the enemy, whom they attacked and routed. On one occasion their escape was due to the cunning of another young lieutenant, who spoke German and held conversations with the enemy in the darkness, deceiving them as to the identity of his force, until they were able to take the German troops by surprise and hack a way through. This lieutenant was hit in the face by a bullet, and when he arrived back in Masnieres with his men in advance of the rear guard, he was only able to make his report before falling in a state of collapse. Other small bodies of cavalry, among them the 8th Dragoons and 5th Hussars, had wild, heroic adventures in the Cambrai salient, where they rode under blasts of machine gun fire and rounded up prisoners in the ruined villages of Noyelles and Fontaine-Notre-Dame. Some of them went into the Folly Wood nearby and met 7 German officers strolling about the glades, as though no war was on. They took them prisoners, but had to release some of them later, as they could not be bothered with them. Later they came across 6 ammunition wagons and destroyed them. In the heart of the wood was one of the German divisional headquarters, and one of our cavalry officers dismounted and approached the cottage stealthily, and looked through the windows. Inside was a party of German officers seated at a table, with beer mugs in front of them, apparently unconscious of any danger near them. Our officer fired his revolver through the windows, and then, like a schoolboy who has thrown a stone, ran away as hard as he could and joined his troop. Youthful folly of gallant hearts. After the enemy's surprise, his resistance stiffened, and he held the village of Fontaine-Notre-Dame and Boulogne Wood on the hill above with strong rear guards. Very quickly, too, he brought new batteries into action, and things became unpleasant in fields and villages where our men, as I saw them on those days, hunted around for souvenirs in German dugouts and found field glasses, automatic pistols, and other good booty. It seemed to me that the plan as outlined by General Louis Vaughan, not to exploit success farther than justified by the initial surprise, was abandoned for a time. A brigade of guards was put in to attack Fontaine-Notre-Dame and suffered heavily from machine gun fire before taking it. The 62d Yorkshire Division lost many good men in Boulogne village and Boulogne Wood, into which the enemy poured gas shells and high explosives. Then on November 30th the Germans, under the direction of General von Maritz, came back upon us with a tiger's pounce in a surprise attack which we ought to have anticipated. I happened to be on the way to Gouzeaucourt early that morning, and, going through the village of Fins, next to it, I saw men straggling back in some disorder, and gun teams wedged in a dense traffic moving in what seemed to me the wrong direction. "I don't know what to do," said a young gunner officer. "My battery has been captured and I can't get into touch with the brigade." "What has happened?" I asked. He looked at me in surprise. "Don't you know? The enemy has broken through." "Broken through where?" The gunner officer pointed down the road. "At the present moment he's in Gouzeaucourt." I went northward and saw that places like Hermes and Havrincourt, which had been peaceful spots for a few days, were under heavy fire. Barlon Wood beyond was a fiery furnace. Hell had broken out again and things looked bad. There was a general packing up of dumps and field hospitals and heavy batteries. In Gouzeaucourt and other places our divisional and brigade headquarters were caught napping. Officers were in their pajamas or in their baths when they heard the snap of machine gun bullets. I saw the guards go forward to Gouzeaucourt for a counter-attack. They came along munching apples and whistling, as though on peace maneuvers. Next day, after they had gained back Gouzeaucourt, I saw many of them wounded, lying under tarpaulins, all dirty and bloody. The Germans had adopted our own way of attack. They had assembled masses of troops secretly, moving them forward by night under the cover of woods, so that our air scouts saw no movement by day. Our line was weakly held along the front. The 55th Division, thinned out by losses, was holding a line of 13,000 yards, 3 times as much as any troops can hold, in safety, and the German storm troops, after a short, terrific bombardment, broke through to a distance of 5 miles. Our tired men, who had gained the first victory, fought heroic rear guard actions back from Mazieres and Marcoing, and back from Barlon Wood on the northern side of the salient. They made the enemy pay a high price in blood for the success of his counterattack, but we lost many thousands of brave fellows, and the joy bells which had rung in London on November 20th became sad and ironical music in the hearts of our disappointed people. So ended 1917, our black year. And in the spring of 1918, after all the losses of that year, our armies on the Western Front were threatened by the greatest menace that had ever drawn near to them, and the British Empire was in jeopardy. Part 7, Chapter 8. In the autumn of 1917, the Italian disaster of Caporetto had happened, and Sir Herbert Plumer, with his Chief of Staff, Sir John Harrington, and many staff officers of the Second Army, had, as I have told, been sent to Italy with some of our best divisions, so weakening Sir Douglas Haig's command. At that very time, also, after the bloody losses in Flanders, the French government and General Headquarters brought severe pressure upon the British War Council to take over a greater length of line in France, in order to release some of the older classes of the French army who'd been under arms since 1914. We yielded to that pressure, and Sir Douglas Haig extended his lines north and south of St. Quentin, where the Fifth Army, under General Gough, was entrusted with the defence. I went over all that new ground of ours, out from Noyon to Chorney and Barresis, and the floods of the Oise by La Fère, out from Ham to Holman Forest, and Francely, and the Epine de Dullen, and the Fort de Liesse by St. Quentin, and from Peronne to Hargicourt and Gincourt and La Vergier. It was a pleasant country, with living trees and green fields not annihilated by shell fire, though with the naked eye I could see the scarred walls of St. Quentin Cathedral, and the villages near the front lines had been damaged in the usual way. It was dead quiet there for miles, except for short bursts of harassing fire now and then, and odd shells here and there, and bursts of black shrapnel in the blue sky of mild days. Paradise after Flanders, said our men, but I knew that there was a great movement of troops westward from Russia, and wondered how long this paradise would last. I looked about for trench systems, support lines, and did not see them, and wondered what our defence would be if the enemy attacked here in great strength. Our army seemed wonderfully thinned out. There were few men to be seen in our outpost line or in reserve. It was all strangely quiet, alarmingly quiet, yet pleasant for the time being. I had a brother commanding a battery along the railway line south of St. Quentin. I went to see him, and we had a picnic meal on a little hill staring straight towards St. Quentin Cathedral. One of his junior officers set the gramophone going. The colonel of the artillery brigade came jogging up on his horse and called out, "Fine morning, and a pretty spot." The infantry divisions were cheerful, like a rest cure. They said they had sports almost within sight of the German lines. I saw a boxing match in an Irish battalion, and while 2 fellows hammered each other, I glanced away from them to winding, wavy lines of chalk on the opposite hillsides, and wondered what was happening behind them in that quietude. "What do you think about this German offensive?" I asked the general of a London division, General Gorringe of the 47th, standing on a wagon and watching a tug of war. From that place also we could see the German positions. "GHQ has got the wind up," he said. "It is all bluff." General Hall, temporarily commanding the Irish division, was of the same opinion and took some pains to explain the folly of thinking the Germans would attack. Yet day after day, week after week, the intelligence reports were full of evidence of immense movements of troops westward, of intensive training of German divisions in back areas, of new hospitals, ammunition dumps, airplanes, battery positions. There was overwhelming evidence as to the enemy's intentions. Intelligence officers took me on one side and said, "England ought to know. The people ought to be prepared. All this is very serious. We shall be up against it." G.H.Q. was convinced. On February 23, the war correspondents published articles summarizing the evidence, pointing out the gravity of the menace, and they were passed by the censorship. But England was not scared. Dances were in full swing in London. Little ladies laughed as usual, light-hearted. Flanders had made no difference to national optimism, though the hospitals were crowded with blind and maimed and shell-shocked. "I am skeptical of the German offensive," said Mr. Bernard Law. Nobody believed the war correspondents. Nobody ever did believe us, though some of us wrote the truth from first to last, as far as the facts of war go apart from deeper psychology and a naked realism of horrors and losses and criticism of facts which did not come within our liberty of the pen. They were strange months for me. I felt that I was in possession, as indeed I was, of a terrible secret which might lead to the ending of the world, our world, as we knew it with our liberties and power. For weeks I had been pledged to say no word about it, to write not a word about it, and it was like being haunted by a spectre all day long. One laughed, but the spectre echoed one's laughter and said, "Wait." The mild sunshine of those spring days was pleasant to one's spirit in the woods above La Fère, and in fields where machine guns chattered a little, while overhead our airplanes dodged German Archies. But the spectre chilled one's blood at the reminder of vast masses of field grey men drawing nearer to our lines in overwhelming numbers. I motored to many parts of the front, and my companion sometimes was a little Frenchman who had lost a leg in the war, D'Artagnan, with a wooden peg, most valiant, most gay. Along the way he recited the poems of Ronsard. At the journey's end one day he sang old French chansons in an English mess within gunshot of the German lines. He climbed up a tree and gazed at the German positions, and made sketches while he hummed little tunes, and said between them, "Ah, les sacres botches. If only I could fight again." I remember a pleasant dinner in the old town of Noyon, in a little restaurant where two pretty girls waited. They had come from Paris with their parents to start this business, now that Noyon was safe. Safe, oh Lord, and everything was very dainty and clean. At dinner that night there was a hostile air raid overhead. Bombs crashed. But the girls were brave. One of them volunteered to go with an officer across the square to show him the way to the APM, from where he had to get a pass to stay for dinner. Shrapnel bullets were whipping the flagstones of the Grand Place from anti-aircraft guns. The officer wore his steel helmet. The girl was going out without any hat above her braided hair. We did not let her go, and the officer had another guide. One night I brought my brother to the place from his battery near St. Quentin. We dined well, slept well. "Noyon is a good spot," he said. "I shall come here again when you give me a lift." A few days later my brother was firing at masses of Germans with open sights, and the British Army was in a full-tide retreat, and the junior officer, who had played his gramophone, was dead, with other officers and men of that battery. When I next passed through, Noyon shells were falling into it, and later I saw it in ruins, with the glory of the Romanesque cathedral sadly scarred. I have ofttimes wondered what happened to the little family in the old hotel. So March 21st came, as we knew it would come, even to the very date, and Ludendorff played his trump cards and the great game. Before that date I had an interview with General Gough, commanding the Fifth Army. He pulled out his maps, showed his method of forward redoubts beyond the main battle zone, and in a quiet, amiable way spoke some words which froze my blood. "We may have to give ground," he said. "If the enemy attacks in strength, we may have to fall back to our main battle zone. That will not matter very much. It is possible that we may have to go farther back. Our real line of defense is the Somme. It will be nothing like a tragedy if we hold that. If we lose the crossings of the Somme, it will of course be serious, but not a tragedy even then. It will only be tragic if we lose Amiens, and we must not do that. The crossings of the Somme, Amiens. Such a thought had never entered my imagination. General Gough had suggested terrible possibilities. All but the worst happened. In my dispatches, reprinted in book form with explanatory prefaces, I have told in full detail the meaning and measure of the British retreat, when 48 of our divisions were attacked by 114 German divisions and fell back fighting stubborn rearguard actions, which at last brought the enemy to a dead halt outside Amiens and along the river Ancre northward from Albert, where afterward, in a northern attack, the enemy, under Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, broke through the Portuguese between Givenchy and Festubert, where our wings held, drove up to Bailleul, which was burned to the ground, and caused us to abandon all the ridges of Flanders which had been gained at such great cost, and fall back to the edge of Ypres. In this book one need not narrate all this history again. They were evil days for us. The German offensive was conducted with masterly skill, according to the new method of infiltration which had been tried against Italy with great success in the autumn of 17 at Caporetto. It consisted in a penetration of our lines by wedges of machine gunners, constantly reinforced and working inward, so that our men, attacked frontally after terrific bombardment, found themselves under flanking fire on their right and left and in danger of being cut off, taking advantage of a dense fog, for which they had waited according to meteorological forecast. The Germans had easily made their way between our forward redoubts on the Fifth Army front, where our garrisons held out for a long time, completely surrounded, and penetrated our inner battle zone. Through the gaps they made they came in masses at a great pace with immense machine gun strength and light artillery. On the Third Army front, where penetrations were made, notably near Bullecourt between the 6th and 51st Divisions, the whole of our army machine was upset for a time like a watch, with a broken mainspring and loose wheels. Staffs lost touch with fighting units. Communications were broken down. Orders were given but not received. After enormous losses of men and guns, our heavy artillery was choking the roads of escape, while our rear guards fought for time rather than for ground. The crossings of the Somme were lost too easily. In the confusion and tumult of those days, some of our men, being human, were demoralized and panic-stricken, and gave ground which might have been longer held. But on the whole, and in the mass, there was no panic, and a most grim valor of men who fought for days and nights, without sleep, fought when they were almost surrounded, or quite surrounded, and until few of them remained to hold any kind of line. Fortunately, the Germans were unable to drag their heavy guns over the desert they had made a year before in their own retreat, and at the end of a week their pace slackened and they halted in exhaustion. I went into the swirl of our retreat day after day, up by Guiscard and Ham, then, as the line moved back, by Peronne and Bapaume, and at last on a dreadful day by the windmill at Pozières, our old heroic fighting ground, where once again after many battles the enemy was in Courcelette and High Wood and Delville Wood, and as I saw by going to the right through Albert, driving hard up to Mametz and Montauban. That meant the loss of all the old Somme battlefields, and that struck a chill in one's heart. But what I marveled at always was the absence of panic, the fatalistic acceptance of the turn of fortune's wheel by many officers and men, and the refusal of corps and divisional staffs to give way to despair in those days of tragedy and crisis. The northern attack was in many ways worse to bear and worse to see. The menace to the coast was frightful when the enemy struck up to Bailleul and captured Kemmel Hill from a French regiment which had come up to relieve some of our exhausted and unsupported men. All through this country between Esters and Merville, to Steenwijk, Mettern, and Bailleul, thousands of civilians had been living on the edge of the battlefields, believing themselves safe behind our lines. Now the line had slipped, and they were caught by German shell fire and German guns, and after nearly 4 years of war had to abandon their homes like the first fugitives. I saw old women coming down lanes where 5.9s were bursting and where our gunners were getting into action. I saw young mothers packing their babies and their bundles into perambulators while shells came hurtling over the thatched roofs of their cottages. I stood on the Mont des Chats looking down upon a wide sweep of battle, and saw many little farmsteads on fire, and Bailleul one torch of flame and smoke. There was an old monastery on the Mont des Chats which had been in the midst of a cavalry battle in October of 1914, when Prince Max of Hesse, the Kaiser's cousin, was mortally wounded by a shot from one of our troopers. He was carried into the cell of the old prior, who watched over him in his dying hours when he spoke of his family and friends. Then his body was borne down the hill at night and buried secretly by a parish priest, and when the Kaiser wrote to the Pope, desiring to know the whereabouts of his cousin's grave, The priest to whom his message was conveyed said, "Tell the Kaiser he shall know when the German armies have departed from Belgium, and when reparation has been made for all their evil deeds." It was the prior who told me that story, and who described to me how the British cavalry had forged their way up the hill. He showed me the scars of bullets on the walls and the windows from which the monks looked out upon the battle. "All that is a wonderful memory," said the prior. "Thanks to the English, we are safe and beyond the range of German shells." I thought of his words the day I climbed the hill to see the sweep of battle beyond. The monastery was no longer beyond the range of German shells. An 8-inch shell had just smashed into the prior's parlor. Others had opened gaps in the high roofs and walls. The monks had fled by order of the prior, who stayed behind, like the captain of a sinking ship. His corridors resounded to the tramp of army boots. The Ulster gunners had made their headquarters in the refectory, but did not stay there long. A few days later, the monastery was a ruin. From many little villages caught by the oncoming tide of war, our soldiers helped the people to escape in lorries or on gun wagons. They did not weep, nor say much, but were wonderfully brave. I remember a little family in Rebecca whom I packed into my car when shells began to fall among the houses. A pretty girl, with a little invalid brother in her arms and a mother by her side, pointed the way to a cottage in a wood some miles away. She was gay and smiling when she said, "Au revoir et merci." A few days later, the cottage and the wood were behind the German lines. The Northern Defence, by the 55th Lancashires, 51st Highlanders, who had been all through the Somme retreat, the 25th Division of Cheshires, Wiltshires and Lancashire Fusiliers, and the 9th Scottish Division, and others, who fought with their backs to the wall, as Sir Douglas Haig demanded of them, without reliefs, until they were worn thin, was heroic and tragic in its ordeal, until Foch sent up his cavalry. I saw them riding in clouds of dust, and heard the panting of their horses, followed by divisions of blue men in hundreds of blue lorries tearing up the roads, and forming a strong blue line behind our thin brown line. Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria had 26 fresh divisions in reserve, but had to hold them until other plans were developed, the Crown Prince's plan against the French, and the attack on Arras. The defence of Arras by the 3D and 56th Divisions, the Iron Division, and the London Division on the left, and by the 15th Division and Guards on the right, saved the centre of our line and all our line. We had a breathing space while heavy blows fell against the French and against 3 British divisions who had been sent to hold a quiet sector on their right. The Germans drove across the Chemin des Dames, struck right and left, terrific blows, beat the French back, reached the Marne again, and threatened Paris. Foch waited to strike. The genius of Foch was that he waited until the last minute of safety, taking immense risks in order to be certain of his counterstroke. For a time he had to dissipate his reserves, but he gathered them together again. As quick as the blue men had come up behind our lines, they were withdrawn again. 3 of our divisions went with them, the 51st Highlanders and 15th Scottish, and the 48th English. The flower of the French army, the veterans of many battles, was massed behind the Marne, and at Chateau Thierry the American Marines and infantry were given their first big job to do. What happened all the world knows. The Crown Prince's army was attacked on both flanks and in the centre, and was sent reeling back to escape complete annihilation. Part 7, Chapter 9. Ludendorff's great offensive had failed and had turned to ruin. Some of the 26 fresh divisions under Ruprecht of Bavaria were put into the melting pot to save the Crown Prince. The British army, with its gaps filled up by 300,000 new drafts from England, the young brothers of the elder brothers who had gone before, was ready to strike again, and on August 8 the Canadians and Australians north and south of the Somme, led by many tanks, broke the enemy's line beyond Amiens and slowly but surely rolled it back with enormous losses. For the first time in the war, the cavalry had their chance of pursuit and made full use of it, rounding up great batches of prisoners, capturing batteries of heavy and light guns, and fighting in many actions. August 8, writes Ludendorff, was the black day of the German army in the history of this war. He describes from the German point of view what I and others have described from the British point of view, and the general narrative is the same: a succession of hammer blows by the British armies, which broke not only the German war machine, but the German spirit. It was a marvelous feat when the 19th Division and the Welsh waded at dusk across the foul waters of the River Ancre, under the heights of Thiepval, assembled under the guns of the enemy up there, and then, wet to their skins, and in small numbers compared with the strength of the enemy, stormed the huge ridges from both sides, and hurled the enemy back from what he thought was an impregnable position, and followed him day by day, taking thousands of prisoners and smashing his rear guard defences one by one. The most decisive battle of the British front in the comeback, after our days of retreat, was when, with the gallant help of American troops of the 27th New York Division, our men of the English Midlands, the 46th Division, and others broke the main Hindenburg line along the St. Quentin Canal. That canal was 60 feet wide, with steep cliffs rising sheer to a wonderful system of German machine gun redoubts and tunneled defences between the villages of Bellecourt and Bellinglis. It seemed to me an impossible place to assault and capture. If the enemy could not hold that line, they could hold nothing. In a dense fog on Sunday morning, September 30th, our men, with the Americans and Australians in support, went down to the canal bank, waded across where the water was shallow, swam across in life belts where it was deep, or got across somehow and anyhow, under blasts of machine gun fire, by rafts and plank bridges. A few hours after the beginning of the battle, they were far out beyond the German side of the canal, with masses of prisoners in their hands. The Americans on the left of the attack, where the canal goes below ground, showed superb and reckless gallantry. They forgot, however, to mop up behind them, so that the enemy came out of his tunnels and the Australians had to cut their way through. And that evening I met their escorts with droves of captured Germans. They had helped to break the last defensive system of the enemy opposite the British front, and after that our troops fought through open country on the way to victory. I saw many of the scenes which led up to Mons and Le Cateau and afterward to the Rhine. Something of the horror of war passed when the enemy drew back slowly in retreat from the lands he had invaded, and we liberated great cities like Lille and Roubaix and Tourcoing, and scores of towns and villages where the people had been waiting for us so long, and now wept with joy to see us. The entry into Lille was unforgettable, when old men and women and girls and boys and little children crowded round us and kissed our hands. So it was in other places, yet not all the horror had passed. In Courtrai, in Saint-Amand by Valenciennes, in Beauhain and other villages, the enemy's shell fire and poison gas killed and injured many of the people who had been under the German yoke so long and now thought they were safe. Hospitals were filled with women gasping for breath, with gas fumes in their lungs, and with dying children. In Valenciennes the cellars were flooded when I walked there on its day of capture, so that when shells began to fall the people could not go down to shelter. Some of them did not try to go down. At an open window sat an old veteran of 1870 with his medal on his breast, and with his daughter and granddaughter on each side of his chair. He called out, "Mercy, mercy," when English soldiers passed, and when I stopped a moment clasped my hands through the window and could not speak for the tears which fell down his white and withered cheeks. A few dead Germans lay about the streets, and in Maubeuge, on the day before the armistice, I saw the last dead German of the war in that part of the line. He lay stretched outside the railway station into which many shells had crashed. It was as though he had walked from his own comrades toward our line before a bullet caught him. Ludendorff writes of the broken morale of the German troops, and of how his men surrendered to single troopers of ours, while whole detachments gave themselves up to tanks. Retiring troops, he wrote, greeted one particular division, the cavalry, that was going up fresh and gallantly to the attack, with shouts of blacklegs and war prolongers. That is true. When the Germans left Beauhain, they shouted out to the French girls, "The English are coming. Bravo. The war will soon be over." On a day in September, when British troops broke the Drocourt-Queant line, I saw the 2nd German Guards coming along in batches, like companies, and after they had been put in barbed wire enclosures, they laughed and clapped at the sight of other crowds of comrades coming down as prisoners. I thought then something has broken in the German spirit. For the first time the end seemed very near. Yet the German rear guards fought stubbornly in many places, especially in the last battles round Cambrai, where, on the north, the Canadian Corps had to fight desperately and suffered heavy and bitter losses under machine gun fire, while on the south our naval division and others were badly cut up. General Currie, whom I saw during those days, was anxious and disheartened. He was losing more men in machine gun actions round Cambrai than in bigger battles. I watched those actions from Bourlon Wood, saw the last German railway train steam out of the town, and went into the city early on the morning of its capture, when there was a roaring fire in the heart of it, and the Canadians were rooting out the last Germans from their hiding places. The British Army could not have gone on much farther after November 11th, when the armistice brought us to a halt. For 3 months our troops had fought incessantly, storming many villages strongly garrisoned with machine gunners, crossing many canals under heavy fire, and losing many comrades all along the way. The pace could not have been kept up. There is a limit even to the valor of British troops, and for a time we had reached that limit. There were not many divisions who could have staggered on to new attacks without rest and relief, but they had broken the German armies against them by a succession of hammer strokes, astounding in their rapidity and in their continuity, which I need not here describe in detail, because in my dispatches, now in book form, I have narrated that history as I was a witness of it day by day. Elsewhere the French and Americans had done their part with steady, driving pressure. The illimitable reserves of Americans and their fighting quality, which triumphed over a faulty organization of transport and supplies, left the German high command without hope even for a final gamble. Before them the German troops were in revolt, at last, against the bloody, futile sacrifice of their manhood and people. A blinding light had come to them, revealing the criminality of their warlords in this great swindle against their race. It was defeat and agony which enlightened them, as most people, even ourselves, are enlightened only by suffering and disillusionment, and never by successes. Part 7, Chapter 10. After the armistice I went with our troops to the Rhine and entered Cologne with them. That was the most fantastic adventure of all in 4.5 years of strange and terrible adventures. To me there was no wild exultation in the thought of being in Cologne with our conquering army. The thought of all the losses on the way, and of all the futility of this strife, smote at one's heart. What fools the Germans had been, what tragic fools. What a mad villainy there had been among rival dynasties and powers and politicians and peoples to lead to this massacre. What had anyone gained out of it all? Nothing except ruin, nothing except great death and poverty and remorse and revolt. The German people received us humbly. They were eager to show us courtesy and submission. It was a chance for our young Junkers, for the Prussian in the hearts of young pups of ours, who could play the petty tyrant, shout at German waiters, refuse to pay their bills, bully shopkeepers, insult unoffending citizens. A few young staff officers behaved like that disgustingly. The officers of fighting battalions and the men were very different. It was a strange study in psychology to watch them. Here they were among the Huns. The men they passed in the streets and sat with in the restaurants had been in German uniforms a few weeks before, or a few days. They were the enemy, the men they had tried to kill, the men who had tried to kill them. They had actually fought against them in the same places. At the Domhof Hotel, I overheard a conversation between a young waiter and 3 of our cavalry officers. They had been in the same fight in the village of Noyelles, near Cambrai, a tiny place of ruin where they had crouched under machine gun fire. The waiter drew a diagram on the tablecloth. I was just there. The 3 cavalry officers laughed. Extraordinary. We were a few yards away. They chatted with the waiter as though he were an old acquaintance who had played against them in a famous football match. They did not try to kill him with a table knife. He did not put poison in the soup. That young waiter had served in a hotel in Manchester, where he had served a friend of mine, to whom he now expressed his opinion on the folly of the war and the criminality of his warlords and things in general. Among these last he uttered an epigram which I remember for its brutal simplicity. It was when a staff officer of ours, rather the worse for wine, had been making a scene with the head waiter, bullying him in a strident voice. "Some English gentlemen are swine," said the young waiter, "but all German gentlemen are swine." Some of our officers and men billeted in houses outside Cologne or across the Rhine endeavored to stand on distant terms with the Huns, but it was impossible to be discourteous when the old lady of the house brought them an early cup of coffee before breakfast, warmed their boots before the kitchen fire, said, "God be praised, the war is over." For English soldiers, anything like hostility was ridiculous in the presence of German boys and girls who swarmed round their horses and guns, kissed their hands, brought them little pictures and gifts. "Kids are kids," said a sergeant major. "I don't want to cut their throats. Queer, ain't it?" Many of the kids looked half-starved. Our men gave them bread and biscuit and bully beef. In Cologne the people seemed pleased to see British soldiers. There was no sense of humiliation, no agony of grief at this foreign occupation. Was it lack of pride, cringing, or a profound relief that the river of blood had ceased to flow, and even a sense of protection against the revolutionary mob which had looted their houses before our entry. Almost every family had lost one son, some of them 2, 3, even 5 sons, in that orgy of slaughter. They had paid a dreadful price for pride. Their ambition had been drowned in blood. In the restaurants, orchestras played gay music. Once I heard them playing old English melodies, and I sickened a little at that. That was going too far. I looked round the Café Bauer, a strange scene after 4.5 years Hun hating. English soldiers were chatting with Germans, clinking beer mugs with them. The Germans lifted their hats to English Tommies. Our men, Canadian and English, said cheerio to German soldiers in uniforms without shoulder straps or buttons. English people still talking of Huns, demanding vengeance. The maintenance of the blockade would have become hysterical if they had come suddenly to this German café before the signing of peace. Long before peace was signed at Versailles, it had been made on the Rhine. Stronger than the hate of war was human nature. Face to face, British soldiers found that every German had 2 eyes, a nose and a mouth, in spite of being a Hun. As ecclesiastics would say when not roused to patriotic fury, they had been made in the image of God. There were pleasant-spoken women in the shops and in the farmhouses. Blue-eyed girls with flaxen pigtails courtesied very prettily to English officers. They were clean. Their houses were clean, more spotless even than English homes. When soldiers turned on a tap, they found water came out of it. Wonderful. The sanitary arrangements were good. Servants were hard-working and dutiful. There was something, after all, in German culture. At night the children said their prayer to the Christian God. Most of them were Catholics and very pious. They seemed good people, said English soldiers. At night, in the streets of Cologne, were women not so good. Shameless women, though daintily dressed and comely. British soldiers, English, Scottish, and Canadian, grinned back at their laughing eyes, entered into converse with them, found they could all speak English, went down side streets with them to narrow-fronted houses. There were squalid scenes when the APM raided these houses and broke up an entente cordiale that was flagrant and scandalous. Astonishing climax to the drama of war. No general orders could stop fraternization before peace was signed. Human nature asserted itself against all artificial restrictions and false passion. Friends of mine who had been violent in their hatred of all Germans became thoughtful and said, of course there are exceptions, and the innocent must not suffer for the guilty, and we can afford to be a little generous now. But the innocent were made to suffer for the guilty, and we were not generous. We maintained the blockade, and German children starved, and German mothers weakened, and German girls swooned in the tram cars, and German babies died. Ludendorff did not starve or die. Neither did Hindenburg, nor any German warlord, nor any profiteer. Down the streets of Cologne came people of the rich middle classes, who gorged themselves on buns and cakes for afternoon tea. They were cakes of ersatz flour with ersatz cream, and not very healthy or nutritious, though very expensive. But in the side streets, among the working women, there was, as I found, the wolf of hunger standing with open jaws by every doorway. It was not actual starvation, but what the Germans call Unternahrung, undernourishment, producing rickety children, consumptive girls, and men out of whom vitality had gone. They, stinted and scraped on miserable substitutes and never had enough to eat. Yet they were the people who for 2 years at least had denounced the war, had sent up petitions for peace, and had written to their men in the trenches about the great swindle and the gilded ons. They were powerless, as some of them told me, because of the secret police and martial law. What could they do against the government, with all their men away at the front? They were treated like pigs, like dirt. They could only suffer and pray. They had a little hope that in the future, if France and England were not too hard, they might pay back for the guilt of their warlords and see a new Germany arise out of its ruin, freed from militarism and with greater liberties. So humble people talked to us when I went among them with a friend who spoke good German, better than my elementary knowledge. I believed in their sincerity, which had come through suffering, though I believed the newspaper editors, many people in the official classes, and the old military caste were still implacable in hatred and unrepentant. The German people deserved punishment for their share in the guilt of war. They had been punished by frightful losses of life, by a multitude of cripples, by the ruin of their empire. When they told me of their hunger, I could not forget the hungry wives and children of France and Belgium, who had been captives in their own land behind German lines, nor our prisoners who had been starved, until many of them died. When I walked through German villages, and pitied the women who yearned for their men, still prisoners in our hands, nearly a year after the armistice, and long after peace, a cruelty which shamed us. I remembered hundreds of French villages broken into dust by German gunfire, burned by incendiary shells, and that vast desert of the battlefields in France and Belgium, which never in our time will regain its life as a place of human habitation. When Germans said, "Our industry is ruined, our trade is killed," I thought of the factories in Lille and many towns from which all machinery had been taken or in which all machinery had been broken. I thought of the 1,000 crimes of their war, the agony of millions of people upon whose liberties they had trampled, and upon whose necks they had imposed a brutal yoke. Yet even with all those memories of tragic scenes which in this book are but lightly sketched, I hoped that the peace we should impose would not be one of vengeance, by which the innocent would pay for the sins of the guilty, the children for their fathers' lust, the women for their warlords, the soldiers who hated war for those who drove them to the shambles. But that this peace should in justice and mercy lead the working people of Europe out of the misery in which all were plunged, and by a policy no higher than common sense, but as high as that, establish a new phase of civilization in which military force would be reduced to the limits of safety for European peoples eager to end the folly of war and get back to work. I hoped too much. There was no such peace.
This concludes the 17th part of 18 total of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.